Greetings learners, my name is Chantal Oliphant and today I would like to welcome you to our lesson, The Building Blocks of Comprehension Skills. So, for this lesson, you're going to be focusing on reading and viewing. Now remember, we are specifically going to focus on comprehension strategies or comprehension skills. So remember, there are three aspects that we're going to look at, right? It will be skimming and scanning and questions related to a text. We're also going to read our text very carefully and we'll be answering questions about that text. Now, what are we going to be able to do at the end of this lesson? We will be gaining knowledge of the building blocks of comprehension. We're also going to be acquiring reading skills. Then we're going to recognize and understand the inference and interpretation type of questions. We're going to be gaining the technique to answer questions. That's always important. And then we're going to understand our exam questions as soon as we're done with this lesson. Now, some keywords and language that you need to be aware of. Remember, we're going to look at the meaning of inference because this is going to be important in the type of questions we're going to answer, interpretation, reorganization, literal, and figurative meaning. Now remember, we need to understand these terms. Okay, let's look at the common errors that we encounter. In many cases, learners fail to understand the comprehension passage, which means they're not understanding the content of what they're reading. Then also, they are unable to respond correctly to our inference type. Now remember, we mentioned this earlier, as well as our interpretation kind of questions. Right, we're moving on. What do we know? We know from grade 10 that we focused on reading skills, comprehension skills, the guidelines of how we read a comprehension, and also answering techniques. Now you must know that these skills are going to be refined in grade 12. Let's look at exam writing competencies. This is when you are sitting in your exam sitting, all right? So your reading skills becomes important, time management skills, responding to questions correctly, remember our inference as well as our interpretation kind of questions. And remember, this is becoming rather important when you hit an exam setting. Learners, we are off to an ad break and we'll see you shortly. Welcome back from our ad break. We will now continue our lesson on comprehension strategies or comprehension skills. So the first aspect we're going to be looking at is skimming and scanning a question, right? So let's look at what we need to know. So in many cases, learners are unable to do this. They're not able to skim or scan or predict or link prior knowledge to what they've read in a comprehension text. So you need to be able to grasp the gist or the feel of what the writer says in that text, and that's very important in order for you to answer questions. Right, so let's particularly look at skimming and scanning. So remember, you have to read the heading or the title of the text. So this is important because remember, you get a feel of the writer's intention. Try to determine what the heading wants to convey. Remember, there's a message that this text is conveying to the reader. Focus on the byline. So usually the byline appears under the heading or just under the title. So usually this creates your atmosphere and it provides a setting for the text to be understood. Skim through the text to get an impression of the context. Just get an idea of what it is about. Note the difficult or the unfamiliar words. all right? And this is important because it helps you to understand what is happening in a text. And then read the questions to get a scope of what those questions will require of you. So let's look at an example quickly of how we skim and scan a text. So here's an example of your comprehension title. Why do teenagers act the way they do? All right, remember, these are only the titles. So, and my second title is Global Warming, a Crisis in the Making. So remember what we said about a title? It sort of shapes your idea of what the text is about. Let's look at our solutions. So why do teenagers act the way they do? Why gives reasons for. Teenagers, remember, it's a specific group that you're dealing with there. So it's not your adults, it's not infants, they are dealing with teenagers. And then acting refers to a kind of behavior. The way they do implies that they act a certain way, or their underlying reasons why they act in that way. All right. Then, global warming, a crisis in the making. Already, all right, when you see the exclamation mark at the end of the sentence, it implies that there's some sort of command or some sort of imperative reason why that exclamation mark is there. So global warming, remember, it's your air temperature rising. Crisis, it says there's danger, there's a red flag. And then in the making implies that this is an ongoing process, all right? This continuity here. So can you see how when you skim and scan the title of the comprehension, you're sort of shaping your head around what you need to understand? Right, so let's see. We are now moving on to the next part of our comprehension strategies, and that is reading the text carefully, all right? So why do I have to read the text carefully? Remember, when learners are unable to read the text, they are unable to extract information, and they cannot decode it or break it down to understand what was written in that text. And remember, when you misinterpret this, it is very difficult to respond to the questions. You need to make sense of that text, all right? You need to make logical connections in your text. So that becomes very vital, why we read so intently, why we read carefully. So let's take the time to read closely for not only meaning, but also for understanding, all right? So there's a difference between the two, right? Remember, when you're reading for meaning, you are just picking up from the text what the writer is saying. But when you understand what you've read, you're interpreting. So you're adding on to what you've read. So think about the following. Who are the characters in a fiction text or the people written about in a non-fiction text? So we're answering the question, who? What is the main idea? All right? And then where do the events take place in this extract? Remember, you're trying to acquire meaning. You're gaining knowledge. You need to understand what's happening. When do the events in the extract take place? All right? Why has this text been written? How does the writer express him or herself? And then what type of language is used? Remember, when we are reading our comprehension text, it is formal language, all right? So you need to become accustomed to reading formal language. Then also, you need to consider both the literal as well as figurative meaning of the words, of the phrases, of the sentences that you are reading in a comprehension. Right, let's move on. So here's an example of a paragraph, right? Remember, in the first part of the segment, we looked at a title. Now we're going to look at a paragraph. So I'll be reading. Teenagers display unpredictable, reckless, and impulsive behavior, unstable emotions, and a parade of identities which seem to change as fast as a runway model's wardrobe. What causes all this chaos and confusion? I study teenage brains and teenage behavior at a center that focuses on adolescent risk-taking. Now remember, we're looking for main idea, unfamiliar words, as well as interrogative questions. We have just read our comprehension passage, and now we're going to be moving on to our solution. Now remember, we're looking for our main idea, unfamiliar words as well as interrogative questions. So let's just look at the following. The main idea is that unstable teenage behavior is compared to a model's runway wardrobe. So if you look into your paragraph, you'll see the text identifies it right there, all right? So that is the main idea that's being focused on. Quickly look at our unfamiliar words, which means words that you haven't understood in the text, right? So we have identified unpredictable, impulsive, as well as reckless. So let's just identify it in our text, and there we found it. Now remember, okay, if you know how quickly a runway model must change her wardrobe, you'll understand the words unpredictable, reckless, and impulsive. That's how quickly it needs to happen, right? Now, our next aspect we're looking at, interrogative questions. So the who, the what, the why, okay? So who are we talking about in this text? Teenagers, all right? What have we identified from this paragraph? Something about their behavior, okay? And also why their adolescent behavior is risk-taking, okay? So you've just identified the main idea, unfamiliar words, as well as interrogative questions. And remember, these help you to understand and give meaning to your text. Learners, we are now going to an ad break. I will see you shortly. Welcome back, learners. We will now continue with the last segment of gaining our comprehension strategies or comprehension skills. Now remember, we have already covered the skim and scanning, all right, and responding to questions. Then we also did reading our text carefully, all right, and now we're going to move on to answering questions based on a particular text, right. So one of the issues that we have to deal with is that learners are unable to recognize and understand the inference and interpretation type questions, all right? Also, learners are struggling to decode the scope of a question. Now remember, the scope of the question is what a question requires. Learners are unable to respond to the scope required by a particular question. So many learners, when writing or answering a comprehension, they fail to respond to the scope of a question, all right? And they cannot interpret or make the correct inferences based on the text that they have read. Many times, learners fail to decode the question and the instruction keyword in that question. So let's look at the concepts, right, that we're supposed to know. Remember, your comprehension text is a working document. Now, the reason why we're saying this is that you can use your comprehension text, highlight, scratch, make little notes, and note while you're going along as you're reading. Work your text, right? Read the questions to highlight the following. The question word or the instruction keyword. So remember, your question word is also called your instruction keyword. The limit or the textual reference of that particular question, all right, as well as the content required to answer those questions. Now remember, all of these will appear on your question paper, so you can use it. Remember, we use it, working document. As you read the questions, jot down any answers that may come to mind, because remember, you've read the text already. So anything that pops up, make sure you make notes of them. Then always read the answer that you have written. And this is very important. Remember, you are rushed, you are determined to finish the paper, so check what you've written. Because many times you omit a preposition or a full stop, or you just need to add in another piece of meaning that you've omitted. Some tips for answering comprehension questions, right? Remember, your mark allocation is a good indicator of how many points you're required to answer, okay? So use that as a guide. Look for keywords. This is very important, all right? Or a topic sentence. all right? Because that in the text will guide you to what your answer requires of you. Do not copy directly from the text unless you are asked to quote, all right? Now remember, this is considered plagiarism, so you cannot lift directly from the text. Answer questions in your own words as far as possible, and this is important, using full sentences. Remember, you are in a formal setting, so you need to respond in that way as well. Your true and false questions do not share similarities with a yes and no question, all right? You are going to respond differently to them. Always back up your true and false and your yes or no answer with a reason. So you need to support why you are saying yes or no, or why you are saying true or false, unless otherwise stated. So the exam question will determine how you respond to your true or false and your yes and no question. Quote means you lift from the text. So this is the only time you're allowed to lift from the text. All right, so don't add or subtract anything. It means it needs to come directly from the text. And remember, as soon as you're quoting, you have to insert inverted commas, all right? And remember, you have to do that, otherwise you are going to be lifting from your text. Let's see if you can answer a question, all right, based on a paragraph given to you. So I'm going to read this paragraph so that we understand what we're reading. She stared across the floor to the balance beam ahead of her. Lindy knew this was her make or break moment. Then the nagging ache in the ankle shot like an arrow up into her right leg to her hip. The sudden pain made her face twitch. Then she knew her leg was not going to carry her to the vault onto the balance beam. Her heart sank. She raised her hand to call the official towards her. Now remember, we're analyzing the scope of the question. So here, we've just read the paragraph. So in your head, you start making interpretations. You start making inferences. What is this about? Where am I going to? What is this paragraph trying to inform me about? Okay. Learners, let's look at the solution. Remember, we've read the question, we've read the paragraph, so now we're going to answer the question. So, when it says refer to paragraph 1, remember it is locating us in the text. So please, learners, you cannot read any other paragraph, right? It is informing you to refer to paragraph 1, which means that the answer to this question is located in paragraph 1. So for time management skills, you go directly to paragraph 1 to find your response there, all right? And when we read the next part of our instruction or keyword, it says list, all right, which means we have to make a point of what we are going to be looking for, all right? We're listing the information that the question requires. Remember, your textual reference or your limit is the reasons for her withdrawal from the competition. So we're not looking for a withdrawal from anything else, all right? From a relationship or why she doesn't want to continue with the studies. We're looking for the reasons why she withdrew from the competition. So when you look for those sets of information in your paragraph, all right, you will find it exactly there, okay? So why does she withdraw from the competition? Because she felt this pain in her leg and she knew she would not be able to get onto the balance beam to complete her routine. Okay, so remember, when you're analyzing the question, you have to break it up into those parts so that you answer exactly what the scope of the question requires from you. Let's move on to our practice questions immediately. I'm going to read a comprehension text, just a single paragraph, and you will be reading with me. In South Africa, more than 8 million children currently receive social grants from the state. The Department of Social Welfare regards 1.5 million children as orphaned or vulnerable, but only 500,000 of these children have been placed in foster care, leaving a large number still waiting to be placed. Another cause for concern is that 20,000 households in our country are headed by children. Only 1,900 children are adopted in South Africa every year. Now remember, the skill of reading, skimming and scanning is important when we're breaking down a paragraph in order to answer questions based on a comprehension text. So let's see carefully what we're looking at. So we've identified in South Africa, all right, which means they've identified where this is happening. Now look at the figures they have given you. They're saying 8 million children receive social grants from the state. Then they further reference that 1.5 million children are considered orphaned or vulnerable, which means that they're in a position where they cannot care for themselves, right? But only 500,000 of these children are placed in foster care, which means care that is given to them because they are now considered vulnerable, leaving a large number still waiting to be placed. So if you look at 1.5 compared to 500,000, we can see why many of them are waiting to be placed. Another cause for concern, so they're adding on another reason, all right, is that 20,000 households in our country are headed by children, which means there's no adult supervision, there's no adult care, they are taken care of by another child. And only 1,900 children are adopted in South Africa every year. So when we're looking at figures and we're looking at the numbers, it doesn't look very good, all right? So remember, we just skimmed and scanned this text. We identified the information this paragraph is communicating to us. When we looked at the unfamiliar words, all right, we could have identified vulnerable maybe as an unfamiliar word, all right? And then maybe foster care, I've seen it in the text, all right? So there we go. Maybe that is something that you might not be familiar with. So let's see if it becomes clearer as we're going along. Okay, we have a practice question. Refer to paragraph 1. Who is responsible for giving the numbers of orphaned or vulnerable children? Now remember, we need to underline our keywords in our question, all right? And we also have to follow the reference that it gives to where we're going to find this information in the text. So let's go quickly. Refer to paragraph 1, all right? So already you know where you're going to look for this information, okay? We are not going to look anywhere else besides paragraph 1. And now follow the text reference. Then we are looking for the numbers of orphaned or vulnerable children. So already your brain is sort of synced into what you are looking for. So let's go to your paragraph. Now remember, orphaned or vulnerable children is your text reference. So let's see, we found orphaned or vulnerable children in paragraph 1. Okay, so who's responsible for giving us those numbers related to that text reference they're giving you? Okay, so let's look at our response quickly. The Department of Social Welfare, or the Social Welfare Department, or you can just say social welfare. So learners, I want you to understand, all right? Remember, you can answer from where you have referenced it in the text, okay? So it clearly shows you then that this information is linked to the Department of Social Welfare. Okay, remember our skill here, underlining the keywords and following the reference for the text. Right, and we are moving on. A large number, oops, I exposed that quickly. A large number of children are awaiting foster care or adoption. Identify another social problem mentioned in paragraph 1. Do not quote. Look at the guidance they're giving you, all right? So already you know you can't quote, all right? So you're going to have to interpret it. You're going to have to write it in your own words. Are they giving us a location? They are giving us a location. Paragraph 1 again, all right? But what are they looking for? What references do we have to find in the text? So they're looking for another social problem related to adoption and foster care. All right, so let's see if we can find that in the text, okay? Let's look at our response quickly that I exposed earlier. About 20,000 households are headed by children. So already remember, they said look in paragraph 1, and they said look at foster care and look at adoption. So if we find that in the text, you'll find it, there we go, how much children are adopted, all right? And then we're looking at placing in foster care. So they say 20,000 households in our country are headed by children, which means that from our earlier reference, we said that children are not taken care of by an adult, all right? There's no adult supervision. They are taken care by someone of a similar age, all right? So we're moving on. Choose the correct word to complete the following sentence, all right? By using the word only in line 6, the writer is emphasizing that the number of children adopted is, and take note of the ellipses there. So that tells you the sentence is complete. It needs to be completed by you, all right, with something that you're referencing from the text. Okay, so let's see. We have to choose the correct answer, which means there are going to be options that you're going to have to choose from. All right, and let's see if you can complete the sentence. Now remember, locate it in the text, all right? So they're saying only, so there's the word only, you found it in paragraph 1, all right? And let's see, there's only so many children adopted in South Africa, okay? Let's look at our responses. Okay, let's look at our responses. So they've given you 4 options. They're saying it's acceptable, it's incorrect, it's too large, or too small. So how many children are adopted in South Africa? What does the word only imply? Okay, which means that in this case, they're actually saying, not too many kids are adopted, right? So that means we're going to go for the number that they're adopting is too small. They can do a little bit more. Okay, we're moving on to our 4th question. State whether true or false. All right, so remember, you are just judging whether the statement is true or false. The statement has been given to you. And in this case, you have to quote to support the answer. So they're saying more than 2,000 children are adopted in South Africa annually. All right, so in this case, when you're looking at your response, we see that that statement given is not true because only 1,900 children are adopted in South Africa every year. So remember now, when you have a quote, please insert your inverted commas. Otherwise, you are going to be lifted from the text, and that is considered plagiarism. All right, so remember now, when you respond, write your option and then give your quote whether you agree or disagree. Okay, learners, we thank you for attending the session. Learners, we are now going to a short ad break. I will see you soon. Learners, welcome back from your ad break. We will now continue our practice session for the exam questions. Right, so remember we've covered paragraph 1. We will now be looking at paragraph 2 of the comprehension text. And I'll be reading the paragraph to you. Please read along with me. Poverty is often a root cause of child abandonment, threatening the hopes and dreams of these innocents. A mended pair of pants still shows its damage, and so it is with children who adapt to their environment but carry scars with them throughout their lives. Yet every so often someone comes along and does a great patch-up job. They say home is where the heart is. For the children of House Jerome in Irene, the joy on their faces is proof of this. At first glance, you would not know that many were abandoned in dirty toilets or on rubbish dumps. So let's look carefully at what we need to identify in this paragraph. Remember, we are going to make literal and figurative inferences, all right, so that we understand what is happening in this paragraph. So we've identified that poverty is the root cause of child abandonment, all right? So remember, this might be an unfamiliar word to you, and you are going to make sense of it as it is located in the text. So let's just read a little further. Maybe there's going to be information that would help you to understand that word. And it says, it threatens the hopes and dreams of these innocents, which means something about their future is being disrupted. Now, look at the literal and figurative meaning coming through here, all right? A mended pair of pants still shows its damage. So that means if a pants is torn and you have to stitch it up, you're going to see the stitching line, okay? Now, look at the comparison. So it is with children who adapt to their environment. Carry scars, all right? So just as that stitch line is still evident on the pants, the scar remains. So that means somehow they're being fixed, but there's a scar. That abandonment leaves with the kids, right? Every so often, someone comes along and does a great patch-up job. Now, please take note. Look at the inference of the language here. It's linked to this mended pair of pants, all right? The patch-up job, like a recovery, all right? Like a healing that needs to happen. They say home is where the heart is. Now, look at the repetition of that H and H, the alliteration there. Home is where the heart is. So the writer's trying to say there's something comfortable about being at home, all right? And this is linked to the children of House Jerome, which means that somehow this house is offering them some comfort, all right? Some recourse for the action they've been through. And this place is in Irene, okay? And how do we know this? It's because of the joy on their faces, all right? At first glance, you would not know that many were abandoned in dirty toilets or on rubbish dumps. Now take note, we had the word abandonment here, now we see the word abandoned coming through again, and we're trying to make a link, some idea to what this word can mean. So these kids were abandoned in dirty toilets or on rubbish dumps, which means that somehow they were left, they were thrown away, they were discarded. Okay, so remember how we make inferences from a text? Remember how we make literal and figurative meaning. And this paragraph showed clearly how the writer is able to do that. Okay, so let's see if we can answer questions based on this text. Okay, the question says, using your own words, explain what is meant by the phrase root cause in paragraph 2. Refer to both words. Now remember, we have to respond to the scope of the question, all right? So what is this question demanding of you? It says, you need to refer to both words. Which words are they referring to? Root cause. Where are we going to find this? In paragraph 2, which we've just read, okay? So now, we need to find the word root cause in this paragraph. Okay, so if you're reading through and you're skimming and scanning quickly, it says, all right, a mended pair of pants, let's see, all right, carry scars. Can you identify that quickly? All right, because something is giving the root for this problem, all right, and we're going to have to look at both words. So when we look at the response, okay, it says, it is the basic reason for child abandonment. It is the cause, all right, that leads to this child being abandoned, okay? So if you should be allocated marks for root cause, this will mean it goes to the cause of this child being abandoned or the basic reason why this child was abandoned, okay? Can you see how the marks have been allocated to you? Moving on to question 2. Explain why the writer compares a mended pair of pants to children who carry scars. Now remember when we addressed this, we said it is looking at literal as well as figurative. So explain, there's your instruction keyword. So you need to give some reasons why this is happening, okay? And remember we're looking at how the mended pair of pants is compared to the scars that children carry. So when you look at your response, you will see when trousers are mended, all right, the stitches can be seen and they look like a scar. So I'm going to see if I can try and draw what a stitching line would probably look like when you're stitching up a pants. So that resembles the scar when you have hurt yourself and they've stitched it up, all right? So look what the response says. In the same way, or similarly, or just like, all right, children who have been damaged and have emotional scars, all right? So somehow the question says you must do the literal, the trousers, and then the figurative, showing the damage for that child. Okay, our next question. Quote 5 consecutive words, right? Take note, 5 consecutive words, which means it's going to follow after each other, from the text that support the idea that the children of House Jerome are satisfied. Now remember when we did our first reading, how we went through home is where the heart is. We circled the double H and we said, look at the alliteration. It suggests comfort. It means they're comfortable, all right? So when you look at your response, it says, find 5 consecutive words, which means 5 words that follow after each other in the text. So we've located it there, all right? And there a response shows you why you have to give it as required by the question. And look at the inverted commas to show you that you've lifted it from the text, all right? Remember, without the quotation marks, all right, it's going to be considered plagiarism. Okay. When we move on to our next question, it says, many children live in poor conditions. Where are most abandoned children found? Okay, so remember, the conditions that they're living in is not very comfortable, but where are most of them found? So when you look at your reference in the paragraph, it says the abandoned children are in dirty toilets or on rubbish dumps, all right? So let's see how we're going to respond that. Many children were found abandoned in, there we have it, the dirty toilets or on rubbish dumps. Okay, so the question, remember our instruction keyword said where. That means you need to look for places or a place where they were abandoned, okay? So remember to make inferences, all right, based on the question that you are given. Learners, we are now going to a quick ad break. We will see you shortly. Learners, welcome back from your ad break. We will now be wrapping up our session. Remember, we focused on reading and viewing, and we showed you how to do reading for comprehension skills. All right, reading a text so that you can respond to questions. Okay, the aspects that we covered were skimming and scanning a text and how to answer questions related to that text. Then we also showed you how to read a text carefully so that you extract information that is required of you, all right? Then also we showed you to the technique of answering questions for a comprehension text. Okay, moving on, we went through a list of words that you needed to know in order to analyze your comprehension text. So we made inference, interpretation, reorganization, literal, and figurative. Okay? So those are the words that you needed in order to understand your text carefully. Okay? We address the problem that learners fully understand what is communicated in a comprehension text. All right? Because comprehension texts are written for meaning and understanding. Then learners are also unable to respond to inference type questions as well as interpretation type questions. All right. So when looking at the competencies that you needed for the examination, okay? So the examination competencies means you're sitting in an exam setting, and this is how you are going to go through your questions and responding to it. So you need your reading skills, you need critical thinking skills in order to respond to what the question requires that you extract from a comprehension text. Remember to manage your time, all right, because this activity is time bound. If you do not complete, it means you are going to impact the results. Respond to the scope of the question required of you, all right, and also remember you are going to need the following skills in order to cope with your examination. Learners, here are examples of question papers that you may consult to practice the skill of comprehension, all right? Remember that you must hone the skill and in order to respond to question papers and comprehension text in the exams, all right? We thank you so much for being part of the session. We hope the session has helped you and we hope to see you soon.